Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and we don't have that much time, and I don't mean for the planet, but for this specific talk. But I'll just give a very brief introduction of David Wallace Wells right from his book jacket, and say that he is a National Fellow at the New America Foundation, columnist and deputy editor at New York Magazine, and used to be the deputy editor of the Paris Review. But what I will say is, when you heard please buy the books, you should actually buy this book, because I've been reading it, and it is really amazing, but also really important, and kind of changes the way you look at everything, from the water temperature at Lucy Vincent Beach to a warm breeze here today. I want to start by asking you, David. We've in the last 24 hours had two mass shootings, terrible shootings in this country that I know for the next few days are going to dominate the news cycle. What is it going to take for the country to start paying that kind of attention to the climate crisis that we're in right now?
I don't know. I used to think that, like a lot of people, that it would take a kind of single catastrophic event. But we've seen a lot of those recently, and it hasn't totally transformed the way that we consume even news about our weather. I started thinking then it would take a kind of sequence of catastrophic events, but last summer provided exactly that kind of a sequence. We had an unprecedented global heat wave in the northern hemisphere. We had wildfires raging through California, burning much more land than had ever been burned before. We had typhoons hitting China and Asia that were unprecedented, all in the space of a few weeks. And the temperature of our coverage and our conversation about climate change did change a little bit. It's changing in the right direction, but not in a categorical way. And this summer, which has been sort of the same, an unprecedented heat wave in Europe followed a week later by a heat wave that beat those temperatures, for instance.
Hottest temperature I think ever recorded in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
In one of those, and 107 degrees in Paris, which is a place where not everybody even has air conditioning.
Yeah, 5% of Europe has air conditioning, and they're dealing with temperatures now that are regularly above 100 degrees. And we haven't seen dramatic changes in especially our TV coverage, which I think is the thing that the place that's most concerning. There has been a sort of sea change, I would say, in print journalism, in part because the world around us is really changing. But I think that there are real institutional obstacles in most media organizations, and I think it's compounded by the fact that we have a kind of inherited sense of what the audience wants to hear and what they're concerned about, and most people making decisions about that kind of coverage are working off of outdated ideas. When you look at the data, most Americans are concerned about climate change, in fact, quite concerned about climate change. Most of them feel that the media is not doing a good enough job covering the story. Most of them feel that their own anxieties are therefore sort of private anxieties. They don't even talk about it with those that they love or are close to. And the more that we can kind of collectively bring this story out into public, talk about it, share stories, share anxieties, I think the better off we'll be. But we're still far from prioritizing and sort of celebrating is a weird word, showcasing the story at the level that it deserves, because it is not just the story of our time. I think it's very much going to be the dominant story of the 21st century that will shape our politics, our culture, our economy, really everything about the way that we live on this planet. And we need to be storytelling in a way that does justice to that scale.
Well, and just to give people a sense of the scale, there's a page in your book that I just want to read from real briefly, which is, you talk about one of the things that gets most attention when it comes to climate change, which is sea level rise. And you say, you quote from this book, "The Water Will Come." Jeff Goodell runs through just a few of the monuments that will be transformed into underwater relics like sunken ships this century. Any beach you've ever visited, Facebook's headquarters, the Kennedy Space Center, the U.S. largest naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, the entire nations of the Maldives and Marshall Islands, most of Bangladesh, all of Miami Beach, much of South Florida, Venice, the White House, the Winter White House in Mar-a-Lago, Richard Nixon's in Key Biscayne, Harry Truman's in Key West. This is a very partial list. How soon? I just looked at Twitter yesterday, and there was a video of Miami Beach with people walking through, a foot of water in the streets. How soon are we going to see the impacts of that in the way that people have been warning about for some time?
Well, Miami Beach is an interesting example and illustration in the sense that when we imagine Miami Beach underwater, we imagine it totally underwater. But of course, the waters come slowly and more sporadically. So first what you get is unusual, a couple times a year flooding, and then that becomes a kind of regular flooding event. They now have in Miami Beach what they call sunny day flooding. There's been no rain, and yet still parts of the city are underwater. Gradually, those will become more and more common. But I think it's fair to say that in the second half of the century, everything that's now considered solid infrastructure in Miami Beach will be inundated permanently. But a lot of that has to do with a lot of that, that timeline is determined by what we do and how much carbon we emit, and how quickly that triggers some of the melt events like the ones that we saw just this past week in Greenland. There was a completely dramatic, unheard of melt event in Greenland because the heat wave I mentioned a minute ago in Europe then went northwest and passed over Greenland. If the Greenland ice sheet melts, it will alone add 20 feet of sea level to the planet. But just one day of melt last week added a measurable amount of sea level rise. Now, it was just 1/10 of 1 millimeter, so it's not all that much, but it was just a single day of melt. And it was, I think the figure was 11 billion tons of ice melted on that single day. And if that seems crazy and insane to you, which it is, and keep in mind that the average American every year emits enough carbon dioxide to melt 10,000 tons of Arctic ice. So each of you, actually, we're like past the median of wealth in this country, so we're probably emitting more, each of us in this tent. Each of us is probably emitting enough carbon every year to melt more than 10,000 tons of Arctic ice. We can change that story. We can take action collectively and individually to minimize the amount of carbon we're emitting, which will mean relatively less sea level rise. And so projections for what even the next 50 years holds are quite variable. We have projections that are we could have as little as a foot of sea level rise this century. There are projections that we could have as much as 15 feet of sea level rise this century. And that is not a reflection of scientific uncertainty in large part. It's a reflection of human uncertainty. We just don't know what we're going to do, and there's so much variation from a quite aggressive program of carbon decarbonization to a system in which we continue exactly as we have been doing, and it's really frankly, it's like who knows where we'll end up on that spectrum.
Well, if you had 15 feet of sea level rise, what would that do to a city of tens of millions of people like Jakarta, Indonesia?
Well, Jakarta will be underwater in relatively short order in the next couple of decades, not just because of sea level rise, but because it's actually sinking, which is why the government of Indonesia is moving the capital away from Jakarta. And I think we're going to start to see extreme actions like that in more and more places. At the small scale, people moving off the coast, you can already see in some places real estate prices have fallen right on the water, which is kind of remarkable given the real estate dynamics in a country like the United States. But you're also going to see the movement of large-scale infrastructure, and the U.S. military is really concerned about protecting its infrastructure, so they've put together a lot of contingency plans about protecting their naval bases and their airfields, and they may be, because there's so little political friction there, they may be the first movers in the United States to really dramatically move their infrastructure away from these threats. But, it's the truth is, we talk about sea level rise a lot. Sea level rise is for me, among the least pressing concerns when it comes to climate change, because the really dramatic impacts are centuries away. It takes a long time for all that ice to melt. And the really dramatic impacts, which are We could get sea level rise. If we lose all the Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets, we could get 250 to 260 feet of sea level rise. That's centuries and centuries away. So we will have time to adapt to that rise. It'll be really expensive. It'll be really difficult, but we will have time. And in this story, I think time is really our most precious resource. The things we won't have time to adapt for are wildfires, hurricanes, other kinds of extreme weather.
Disease.
The public health impacts, the mosquitoes that used to only fly around the tropics carrying dengue and malaria will be carrying them as far north as the Arctic Circle as soon as 2050. Now there's some ways that we can mitigate and adapt to that. There are scientists who are trying to find ways to drive mosquitoes out of existence. That may have ecosystem implications that we don't yet appreciate. The effects on cognitive performance, where it's your brain works less well if it's hot out. There are effects on mental health, where rates of schizophrenia and depression go up. Levels of conflict go up. So if we end up at the end of the century where we're headed for at about 4 degrees of Celsius warming, we'll probably have twice as much war as we have today. There are agricultural impacts where the grain yields are already falling. Even putting aside the flooding that has totally devastated the plant season in the American Midwest this year, the simple effect of heat reduces grain yields by about 10% for every degree of Celsius warming, maybe a little bit more. So if we end up at 4 degrees this century, we'll have about grain yields that are about half as bountiful as they are today, and we'll be globally trying to use that grain to feed 50% more people. And really everywhere you look, there's these kind of impacts. Maybe the easiest way to sum all of them up, it's a misleading statistic, but is to talk about the economic impacts, because on some level, that calculation, it integrates all of these other various bits of research. And the economists who work in this area say that if we end up on the track we're on by the end of the century, we're likely to have a global GDP that's 30% smaller than it would be without climate change, which is an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. We'd have $600 trillion in climate damages, which is equivalent to twice as much wealth that exists in the world today. So
I'll give you some of our precious fresh water first.
Water is a really interesting case study because we have enough water to, for all of our that we could ever possibly need to serve 10 or 12 billion people, maybe 15 billion people. But we're not delivering it in the way that we need to. We're not managing it in the way that we need to for political reasons. And that's a kind of in its own way, a nice metaphor for the climate crisis, even though climate change is not going to make fresh water so scarce that we won't be able to provide it to the planet if it were properly managed. The problem is that we're not at all properly managing it. And really the same is true for the system as a whole.
Well, so I was at this Trump rally the other day in Cincinnati to cover it, and he went on this riff about energy. And here's what he said. He was talking about windmills. He said to his 20,000 supporters in this crowd, they make noise, they kill your birds, they break down all the time, you have to replace them every 10 years because they wear out, they cost a fortune, and they need subsidies. They're noisy, they got a lot of problems. No, we're going to stay with the great energy that's powering our businesses. We're going to stay the way we have it. We're ending the war on American energy. So he's not only saying, I want to stick with, fossil fuels. He's actually denigrating the alternative forms of energy. He said solar is fine, but it's peanuts compared to what we need. How much of a problem is it that, the president of the United States and a major political party doesn't even agree that climate change is some of them don't even agree that it's real, and they certainly don't agree that it's a crisis that needs to be dealt with, even if it costs America a lot of money?
Well, I think there has been a sort of a change in the way that Republicans talk about climate change just over the last few years, which tracks with changes in the way that the public is seeing this issue. There are many more people in the American public who are concerned about this than were just a couple of years ago. And Republicans, I think very few of them, at least in elected office, are outright deniers anymore. I think that they're much more in the camp of, they would say they're climate realists. I would say that they are they are operating from a place of self-interest and thinking about how they can accumulate American advantage in a world in which competitive dynamics still apply and are governing the behavior of competitive nations. And Trump, I would put in that camp. I think, he doesn't really have a strong opinion that climate change isn't real. He just thinks that he's not going to be the person who's leading the responsible way forward. This is how he's behaved in his entire life. He's never, made a deal and done right by the person he was doing a deal with. He's always looking for advantage on the people that he's engaged with. I think globally, the U.S. should be a leader on climate change because we are responsible for the lion's share of historical emissions. We are the main author of this problem throughout history. But
are we the worst right now?
No, we're kind of a distant second between China, behind China. China is responsible for about 28% of global emissions. The U.S. is responsible for about 15, and I think India is in third with about 8, and then there's a huge gap after that. So the U.S. is going forward not the main driver of this story, and really China will be. But the U.S., because of its particular position as self-proclaimed leader of the free world, also wealthier, considerably wealthier in a per capita way than China, is really in a position of that requires moral leadership, which Donald Trump has forsaken. The damage that one person can do in 4 years of bad policy is limited. On the other hand, we have only about 12 years, the UN says, to really take dramatic action. And that gets back to what I was saying before, which is that time is really our most precious resource. But, to talk about the particular bits of disinformation that he's putting forward in that speech, globally and in the U.S., fossil fuel companies are receiving more subsidies than renewable energy companies are, considerably more. The IMF, which is no lefty, no green organization, this year estimated that globally fossil fuel companies are receiving $5.3 trillion in subsidies. And a report last week showed that, it's a kind of a speculative report, and I haven't looked into it in details, said that we could really power and fund a total global transition from dirty energy to green energy for the cost of about 10 to 30% of those fossil fuel subsidies. So we wouldn't even need to redirect all of those subsidies. We would just need to redirect somewhere between 10 and 30% of them, which is really, when you consider all the damage that's being done by the fossil fuel business to the planet, not at all a small ask. It's also simply not the case that green energy is more expensive or more damaging to bird life than dirty energy. In fact, it's cost competitive with every form of dirty energy in the U.S. It's cheaper than coal, considerably cheaper than coal, cost competitive with oil and gas now, and that's one reason why I think there's some hope for the near future. We basically have a ready substitute for our dirty energy needs in the U.S. It's not quite the case in the rest of the world, but it's moving in that direction quickly. But to Donald Trump's, the last point you made, he's actually right that it's peanuts compared to what we need. Not just solar, green generally, accounts for a tiny fraction of electricity production in the U.S. and globally. We've seen this incredible progress over the last couple of decades where renewable energy has gotten much, 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 much cheaper. In fact, much cheaper than even its most ardent advocates would have predicted a decade or two ago. But we've responded to that not by retiring dirty energy and making our whole system cleaner, but just by expanding our capacity so that the proportion of green energy to dirty energy is now today no bigger than it was 40 years ago when we were putting solar panels on our geodesic domes. That means that globally we're not just in the same place when it comes to this energy transition. We're in a worse place because we've not as much renewable energy as we've added more dirty energy. So we're producing and consuming much more dirty energy than we were 30 or 40 years ago, which is ultimately why we're in the position we're in, staring down a climate catastrophe right in the face much faster, much sooner than any scientist would have predicted even just 20 or 30 years ago, when this was really thought to be a crisis that was going to arrive at the very end of the 21st century, if not later.
I want to ask you about one more scary thing in this book, which there are a lot of them, but one of them is migration. You know, in Europe during the Syrian war that's still going on, but during the sort of heat of it, a million or more than a million people came to Europe and sought asylum in Europe, and it changed the politics of Europe. It had a lot of effects, and people had a hard time adapting to all of these new people coming in. What you say is that's nothing compared to what we're going to see in the very near future of people. We're already seeing it in Central America with people leaving because their farms aren't working anymore the way that they used to because of climate change. But we're going to see a lot of migration very soon.
Yeah, the UN says by 2050 they expect 200 million climate refugees, which is 200 times the size of the Syrian refugee crisis. They say it's possible that we could have 1 billion climate refugees, which is as many people as live today in North and South America combined. I think those numbers are a bit high, but when you understand that just simply from the impact of direct heat, many of the biggest cities in South Asia and the Middle East will be so hot in summer that you won't be able to go outside without risking heat stroke or death. These are cities that today hold 10, 12, 15 million people. It doesn't seem at all hard to imagine that the entire equatorial band of the planet will be, if not completely uninhabitable within a few decades, then certainly so much harder to live in that many people will be leaving those areas and moving northward, which means abandoning communities that are so large, we used to think of them as civilizations, people leaving homesteads that were inhabited by not just their parents and grandparents, but families stretching back thousands of years. Really, we're going to see the abandonment of whole cultures in relatively short order, which is totally heartbreaking. On the other end of things, they're going to be arriving in countries that are, if to judge by our present-day politics, much less hospitable, much less welcoming than they would like, than I would like. We're seeing already a real hardening of the heart of the wealthiest countries of the world towards refugees. The U.S.'s reversal on that has been perhaps most dramatic, but most countries in Europe have had a quite similar response. And I hope that trajectory turns. There is social science suggesting that communities are most hostile to newcomers when those numbers are few, and when they grow, they are more welcoming to outsiders. On the other hand, I don't know yet whether that will play out at the national or international level, and if we're really talking about hundreds of millions or even perhaps as much as 1 billion people needing to resettle over the course of just a few decades, it will be a total strain on the system that we have today, the geopolitical system that we have today, which is one reason I think that system is inevitably going to be changing. And one of the real sort of main themes of my book, especially in its second half, which moves away from the science to questions of how we will all live on a planet that is transformed by these forces, is there is almost no aspect of modern life that will be untouched. You know, our politics, our geopolitics, what will it mean to be imagining a world that's defined by resource scarcity as opposed to a world defined by expectations of economic growth? What will our relationship to nature be, and what will our sense of our place in history be if we have to retire some of our expectations for the future bringing more prosperity? What will it require of us? What kind of empathy will it require of us to sustain fulfilling, prosperous human life in a world that is 2 or 3 or 4 degrees warmer, racked by famine and drought and war in a way that we haven't seen in centuries? How will we think of the modern period? Will we think of it as a time of great progress, or will we think of it as a time when we've sort of brought about real catastrophic human impacts? All of these things are questions I think we haven't yet really begun to think seriously about, and I think those impacts are likely to be as dramatic, as profound as the direct climate ones when we think about just how totally our lives will be shaken in the decades ahead. And I think, unfortunately, what's likely to happen is that we take some action, we avert some amount of warming, but we allow considerably more of it to happen. And yet we respond to that primarily by defining our expectations and our sense of what's normal much higher up into much more suffering, so that we see much more dying, much more pain, much more hunger than we would say is conscionable today, and yet we find a way to compartmentalize or normalize or deny that that is happening so that we still can live comfortably to the extent that we manage to in places like the United States.
Okay, I want to ask you one more question before we open it up to any audience questions that we have, which is, you say we have 12 years. What can the people here do to make a significant difference, or as much difference as one human being can make in dealing with this?
The main thing is vote, because our politics need to change and our policies need to change. So when people ask me what they can do as individuals, I think it's important that everyone lives by their values. So if you want to shrink your carbon footprint, that's important at a personal level. It's important to signal to those around you that you're committed to this issue. It's a way of starting conversations about climate change, which is really important. And it's also a way of signaling to our politicians that we can live prosperous, fulfilling lives and still be responsible. But ultimately, the impacts that can be achieved through individual action are so limited compared to what can be achieved through politics that by far the most important thing that any of us can do is to organize, mobilize, vote, and then hold our politicians accountable to the promises they've made when they've been campaigning, such that our policies really reflect a prioritization of climate change as the top political story of our time. Because no matter what you care about in politics, if you care about wealth creation, if you care about income inequality, if you care about violence, if you care about hunger, if you care about violence against women, if you care about mental health issues, no matter what you care about in this world, climate change has a fingerprint on those impacts. And if we don't get a handle on climate change, it will be much, much, much harder to address each of those challenges. But what I would also say is that when I talk about these impacts, it can seem distressing, dispiriting. I mean, the trajectory that we're on is bringing us to a world that no one here today living in, spending a beautiful weekend in Martha's Vineyard would think of as livable. We're headed there now. But if we bring those scenarios into being, it will be because we have affirmatively chosen to do that. There is very little at the moment that is outside of our control when it comes to climate change. This is a story that we are writing ourselves in real time. In the book I mentioned, half of all of the emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity have been produced in just the last 30 years, which is the 30 years that have brought us from a stable climate to the brink of catastrophe. That means that we have done this damage and risked the future of the planet because of the work of one generation. We have about that much time to take control of the story before it gets out of control. But ultimately, when we imagine the truly terrifying impacts that are possible, they are a reflection of just how much power we retain over the climate. Carbon emissions are what is making the planet warmer. We can choose collectively to stop producing more carbon. There are big questions about who that we is, what human obstacles there are in the way of that action, but they are almost entirely human obstacles. Science is not standing in our way. Technology is not standing in our way. Politics, culture, and economics are. But we have it in our power to make changes to those systems too, if we really understand just how pressing a need action on climate is, and really reorient, in particular, our politics to address it, which is ultimately what politics is for. We're not asked as individuals to demonstrate a commitment to Social Security by donating all of our money to charity before we're asked to pay a single dollar in taxes. We have a system to reorient the abundant wealth we have as a society towards those more in need, because that is the most efficient way of doing that. And at the moment with climate, we have nothing like that, where we're really focusing our powers, not just our wealth, but also our powers of innovation, powers of political mobilization, we have no system to direct that energy towards the pressing crisis of our time. And that is what we need, because we have the tools necessary today to stop warming in its tracks. We just don't have the will or really the system to put those tools into practice.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes for, yes, please applaud that. Let's take some questions right over here at the microphone.
Good morning. Thanks to both of you for coming here on an early Sunday morning. I have a question that's a follow-up to that, which is, how do you see our domestic politics playing out over the next 5, 10, or 20 years? It's very tempting to see this as something that is difficult to break the two-party disagreements over everything, right? We have cities like Miami and New York and Boston that are much more threatened by climate change, and we have places like Texas and Oklahoma and Wyoming that have big economic interests in continuing to invest in fossil fuels. Is there something that may happen in the process of climate change that you think breaks that, or are there strategies we should be mindful of in trying to get towards what will require a more bipartisan approach on the issue?
Well, I think it's actually at the public level already broken. 73% of Americans are concerned about climate change. The majority of Republicans want, quote, aggressive American action to combat climate change. A new study that the Times just wrote about on Friday, I think maybe it was yesterday's paper, found that young Republicans' top political priority is climate change. So the problem is and I would say to your geographical distribution, I mean, actually, some of the most ambitious wind power projects in the country are in red states, in part because they have abundant wind. Texas and Oklahoma have a ton of wind power. And I think many legislators, many executive politicians in those states are actually quite excited about the prospects of a renewable energy revolution because of the obvious economic opportunities that are there. The problem is, as you say, that we have a two-party system. One of those parties is quite totally captured by fossil fuel interests, and the other is, I would say, not captured but influenced by that money. That is really deeply problematic. My own theory of political change, which is maybe naive, is that such a system will have a hard time surviving pressure of 3/4 of the public feeling intensely committed to the issue. My worry, or my worry is not exactly the right word, the problem in that theory is that I think not nearly enough Americans care intensely about climate change. Too many of us think of it as something that needs to be addressed, but really only as a third or fourth or fifth order political priority, not as the overwhelming, orienting feature of our politics. And when I see the climate protests, sunrise here in the U.S., but maybe even more dramatically, the climate strikes in the EU and Extinction Rebellion in the UK, I see great hope for a growing intensity of commitment to this issue, which is ultimately what I think is necessary. And I think we're already starting to see some of those, some of that reflected in democratic politics, where we have a suite of presidential candidates who are almost all of whom competing to see who could be the most ambitious on this in their platforms. The rubber will meet the road there when there's actual legislation to be written. And I think it's going to be a complicated fight. But the more that more people can demonstrate more intensity through public action and public engagement with their leaders, I think the more our policy will reflect that priority, which I think is happening, but again, it's not happening fast enough.
Next question.
Yes, my question is, since I think the consensus is that a greater than 2-degree increase in global temperatures is already, so to speak, baked in, What role do you see carbon removal technology as playing in the future? How important a role? Not just planting forests and cutting down on gasoline use, et cetera, but the actual carbon removal technology, which is slim at this point, but
Well, first I would say I think scientifically speaking, we don't have about 2 degrees baked in. We probably have about 1.5 degrees baked in, but because it's going to be slow to really take action on decarbonization, I think practically speaking, we're not going to be able to avoid 2 degrees of warming. And I think that carbon removal, that's often called negative emissions, are going to play a large role if we have any hope of really stabilizing the climate. You know, scientists say that about 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere is safe. We're at about 411 now. We're adding to that every year. So if we need to get, even if we totally decarbonize, we'd still need to take out 60 parts per million of carbon to make sure that the planet was not going to continue heating. Stop today.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to take out more. Now, these technologies exist. They are machines that work. They're considerably less expensive than they were a few years ago, and they may get cheaper still in the years ahead. They're so cheap that, for instance, paying for them at the present rate to totally neutralize the carbon emissions that you would emit on a cross-country flight in the U.S. would cost only an additional $7, which suggests that they could be even deployable at scale if we chose to do that. But estimates are that in order to rely on them to avoid 2 degrees of warming would require us to open a new 1.5 new plants every day for the next 70 years. And I think the number has changed a little bit, but in my book I say that globally there are 18 of them operating already. So we're very, very far from scaling them. And then there's the backside problem of what we do with the carbon once we captured it. Estimates are that in order to just store that carbon would require a storage industry that was 2 to 3 times the size of today's oil and gas business. And then we'd run into all the issues around NIMBYism that we run into with solar farms and solar panels and all that, or nuclear plants. And so my own feeling is that this is has to be a part of the problem, but that we fall into a little bit of a hopefulness trap when we think that it could be a silver bullet solution. And I would say additionally, we have natural resources that can do similar things. Reforestation, all plant life sucks carbon out of the atmosphere and produces oxygen. So reforestation and different kinds of agricultural practices called regenerative agriculture can really help as well. But even taken all together, those are going to be, I think, a kind of marginal part of the solution, and rapid decarbonization is still the most efficient and necessary path forward.
Well, and it doesn't help when you have presidents like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is not only not reforesting, but actually encouraging deforestation in the Amazon. Yes.
2 questions. What would you do today if you were the energy czar in the United States, irrespective of what powers you would or wouldn't have? And number 2, looking around the world today, what political or what governmental structure do you think would most facilitate the kind of action that we need to take?
Two complicated questions. I think in the U.S., first of all, we need to end fossil fuel subsidies. That's true globally as well. And I think that we need to price carbon efficiently. I don't think a carbon tax is a sufficient solution to the problem. But if we have a price that simply reflects the economic cost from pollution that burning fossil fuels produces, we would already have a much more efficient market solution to this problem. Not to say sufficient, but efficient. I would also like to see a total banning on new fossil fuel infrastructure and really significant investment in research and development in new technologies, not just in battery technology, which is really important to extend all of the gains that we've made in renewables and make them sustainable as a dominant energy supplier, but in zero carbon jet fuel, in new infrastructure technology, new industrial technology, new agricultural approaches, because the best thing that America can do, in addition to like just showing the way, I think, is really invest in technology that can then be exported to the rest of the world. That's been the investments that the Obama administration made in solar during the stimulus package are part of the really big part of the story why solar has been such a success story over the last 10 years, and we need to be making those kinds of investments, actually much bigger investments, all the time. At the global level, honestly, I don't know. My own emotional intuitions as a neoliberal child of the 1990s is to think that something like liberal international order can supply a framework for global cooperation, but that was the framework of the Paris Accords, and just 3 years later, no major industrial nation in the world is on track to meet its commitments under Paris. The only two countries in the world that are operating in a way that's considered workable with the Paris commitments are Morocco and Gambia. And even if we all met our Paris Accord commitments, we would still be on track for more than 3 degrees of warming, which is well past the threshold of catastrophe into some truly terrifying outcomes. So I don't entirely know. I tend to feel that it has to be, at the moment, it has to be the US and China really, really leading the way as a sort of a bilateral initiative, and that the rest of the world will follow suit. But in my heart, I would like to see a revival of the sort of truly international order that is at the moment being unbuilt by leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump and Erdogan and many others.
I'm getting the time signal because there's another event coming in 5 minutes, but thank you, David Wallace Wells, and thanks all for coming to this.
Thank you very much. Thank all you guys.
Okay.